Back in August of 2018, we had a 2.5-year-old and a 1-month-old infant, and so many tomatoes. I didn't want to see those tomatoes go to waste, and so I knew I wanted to learn how to can. I was super intimidated by the process. I had never done it before. I didn't really have anyone to teach me, so I went ahead, I watched some videos, I got a canner, and I taught myself how to can. And here we are 6 years later, and it's a big part of our life and what we do to preserve food. But canning can be super intimidating, especially pressure canning. I know it was for me. I was asking questions like, am I going to blow up our house? Will this food be safe for my family to eat? How do I add this into my already full life? But as I started to do it more, I realized it actually wasn't hard at all. And we started to figure out systems that made canning work for our family, even in kind of day-to-day, week-by-week, everyday sort of life. And it really actually started to make our meal planning and our meal times easier over time. Did you get lots of mulberries? All right, guys, why don't you guys start getting all your shoes on and stuff? Can you guys grab a pool bag?
Okay, we'll get that.
This week and next week, our kids have swimming lessons early every morning, so we are feeling a bit frazzled to get everyone out the door early. I'm gonna be making a big batch of chili this afternoon that we're gonna eat for dinner, and then I'm gonna go ahead and pressure can the rest of that chili. So before we head out here this morning, I need to get our beans cooking. I soaked the beans overnight, so what I need to do now is just bring them to a boil, and then I'm going to slow cook them while we are gone for a couple of hours. The beauty of chili and really a lot of other soups and stews is that they are the perfect food for using all of that fresh or preserved garden goodness. Right now we are in this place of trying to use up all of the preserved food that we have from last year, the things that we canned or froze. So we still have tons of tomato sauce, we have frozen peppers in the freezer, we have garlic, and we have carrots. So I'm gonna be using all of those things in this chili today. Beans in the oven. All right, you guys are totally ready? Everyone has their waters filled?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, here we go, guys.
So let's go.
Let's go, let's go.
Bye, I got the swim bag.
Swimming lessons. Here we go. We did run out of our onions recently and our winter squash, and so those are the other two things that I usually use in chili. So on our way home from swimming lessons, I'm gonna stop by a local grocery store and get some onions, and then I'm gonna get some sweet potatoes to use instead of the winter squash in this chili. We made it back home from swimming lessons, and I'm gonna get going whipping up this big batch of chili. Our kids have been super into picking mulberries lately, and we have a ton of mulberry trees on our property, so they are out picking away. I need to put our littlest down for a nap right now, so I'm gonna enjoy a little bit of quiet to get this chili made. I'll post the link below to the recipe that I am making, but this is our favorite chili recipe. I normally make it with butternut squash that gives it a really nice, creamy, hearty texture, but today I'm gonna use the carrots and the sweet potatoes instead, but it's still gonna be a really nice, hearty chili. So in the food preservation homestead community, the more common thing to do is definitely to start by learning how to water bath can, which is great for preserving certain things, but I actually started by learning how to pressure can, and so now that's all I do. I like it because I feel comfortable with it and I have all of my bases covered. I can use it to can my tomato sauce or my applesauce, but then I can also use my pressure canner to can chilies and soups and stews and other meats. I think most moms and parents can relate to this, but one of my biggest struggles is getting from scratch meals on the table every day, meal after meal, without feeling burnt out or overwhelmed with all of the other things that fill our day-to-day lives. And I really enjoy cooking, and I still find this to be a struggle, especially in certain seasons. And so one thing that we have found to be extremely helpful, especially in those seasons when getting those meals on the table can feel really hard, is batch cooking. I have found that meal times go so much smoother if I'm able to set aside a few hours a couple of times a week to get a few things made in advance. So oftentimes for us, this looks like cooking up some roasted vegetables, a big thing of rice, maybe some muffins or sausage patties for breakfast, and always a large pot of soup or stew that will feed us for at least a couple of meals. That way, no matter what the week throws our way, I'm going to have something ready to go that I can get on the table in just a few minutes. And so I think it just gives me a lot of peace of mind knowing that if we have a busy day or we get invited to go out and do a thing or we want to go for a hike, I don't need to worry about lunch feeling stressful. I have something made and ready to go. But I am always looking for ways to simplify our systems in the kitchen to get the most bang for our buck out of what we're doing and out of our time. So I realized over time, if I'm going to make a pot of soup or a pot of chili, why don't I quadruple the recipe and make a really big batch that I can preserve for the future or that we can have as leftovers? And I do the same thing with other foods as well. Something like burgers. If I'm gonna make burgers, why not make a triple or quadruple batch that I can go ahead and freeze for future meals? And this is where we found pressure canning to be so helpful. You can definitely freeze soups or chilies, but we found that we really prefer the texture of soups and chilies when we can them over when we freeze them. Plus, we have found that it's just easier. It's easier to transport. For example, if we're gonna go out of town, say we're staying at an Airbnb or even going camping, canned soups or stews or chili is like the perfect meal to take with you. You don't need to worry about coolers or ice packs. All you need to do is bring it and heat it up. Only a little messy there. When it comes to canning, I am definitely not an extreme canner. We have different ways that we like to preserve the different foods that we grow. Some of the things we dehydrate, others we freeze. We grow a lot of storage crops that really don't need to be processed at all, but without fail, I always can a ton of tomato sauce and applesauce, and then these ready-to-go meals like soups or stews whenever possible so that we always have a nutritious meal option ready to go at a moment's notice. This is a really thick chili right now, so I'm gonna add some of the bean liquid from draining the beans into this just to thin it out a little bit. Woohoo! Whoops. Well, there you go. Not an exact science.
What color do you want our ponytail to be?
Good seasonings.
Okay.
After I finished making the chili, I'm gonna sterilize our jars. I'm gonna set aside enough chili for our family for dinner, and the rest I'm gonna can for future meals. To clean the jars, I'm just washing them in hot, soapy water. We actually switched to using dish soap bars as opposed to the traditional liquid dish soap in a plastic bottle, and I've loved it. It works really well, it's zero waste, and it's been a really great fit for our family. And so I recently started experimenting with making our own dish soap bars. So this is the first batch of bars that we made that just finished curing. So I'm really excited about how they turned out. So hopefully we'll have that recipe coming up soon. Don't mind the sink full of our lunch dishes. I'm gonna get to those while the chili is canning, but for now I just wanna get this started since it does take a good hour and a half for the canning process to happen. Once our jars are ready, I'm gonna scoop the chili into the jars. Having one of these specially made canning funnels is really helpful for doing this. And so when you're gonna can something with meat, you want to leave 1 inch of headspace at the top of your jar. When I first started canning, I was worried about the jars, and I thought I always had to buy new jars with new bands and new lids every time I canned. You don't need to do that. So the only thing that you need is new lids for canning. There are some companies out there that do sell reusable canning lids, or some people I know do reuse old lids. I don't do that. I do buy new lids whenever I find them in bulk or find them on sale that I'll use for our canning needs, since we already have plenty of jars and bands on hand. But you definitely don't need to buy new everything to can, just new lids. And just a quick disclaimer before we get going here, this is what we are doing for our pressure canner, but you definitely want to read the instructions thoroughly on your pressure canner before you begin for all of the information that you need to know to use it safely. The canner comes with a rack that you place at the bottom, and this is important to keep your jars safe, keep them from cracking, and then you're going to put your jars on top of that rack. And for pressure canning specifically, I've often heard that you need these fancy and often really expensive canners to get the job done. You don't. So we have been using the same basic Presto pressure canner for years now, and it has held up great. It works like a charm, and I think it only costs around $100. And you can also use it as a water bath canner if you water bath as well. So I'll put the link below to the one we have, but you can also often find them secondhand super inexpensively. It's also important to keep your jars safe and to keep them from cracking, that whatever you're putting inside your jars is hot. You don't want to put a cold liquid into the jars, because those major temperature changes are what could cause your jars to crack, and you don't want to open up your canner to find a bunch of broken glass jars. That would be really, really sad. So once your canner is filled with your jars, then we fill it with 3 quarts of warm water. From here, you're gonna put your canner on your stove on high heat. So what you are doing is you are heating everything up and creating steam inside your canner to build pressure. Once it reaches enough pressure, there's a little button, I believe it's called the air vent, that's gonna pop up. And when this pops up, it means it's time to put your weight on. So there's a little vent pipe that sits on top of the canning lid, and you're gonna put your weight on top of that little vent pipe. Pop it all. Oh, there it goes. Depending on what you are canning will determine the pressure per square inch, or PSI, that you need to bring your pressure canner to. So each thing is going to have a certain pressure, and it's going to need to hold there for a certain amount of time. So there are different charts you can find online with this information. I'll link the one below that I often reference to know how long and at what pressure to can different things for. So for this chili, it needs to be canned at a PSI of 11 for 75 minutes. So after the little button popped up and I added the weight to the pressure canner, the pressure is going to begin to climb as indicated by the pressure gauge that's on the lid of the pressure canner. And so once this climbs and hits 11, you want to keep that pressure steady for the next 75 minutes. So this would mean turning that temperature down on your stove from a high that you've had it on to maybe a medium or a low to hold that pressure. Timer. Our stove is a bit unique in that it doesn't have the ability to change the temperature of the stove. Our oven's called an AGA, and we have a few other videos specifically going into more detail about it. But when we got it, one of my biggest concerns was whether or not we'd be able to can with it. but it turns out it works great for pressure canning. So what I do is I bring everything to pressure on the hotter plate. So for our oven, that's called the boiling plate. And then once the pressure is achieved and we reach the 11 PSI, I move it to the simmer plate, which is the less hot plate. Once we hit that 11 PSI, I set my timer for 75 minutes and I'm gonna keep it on the simmer plate. I never go too far from the kitchen when I'm canning because I like to keep an eye on what I'm canning and check it regularly to make sure that pressure doesn't shift too far from where it needs to be. All good in the hood. So sometimes it's gonna start to creep up and get, you know, to 12, 13, or 14. And if this happens, you wanna turn your stove down. Other times, your pressure could dip below that 11 PSI, and in this case, you would need to turn your stove up a bit. So either way, it's just something that you wanna be keeping an eye on every few minutes. Once I'm feeling pretty confident about where our canner is at and where the pressure is at, I'm gonna run out just for a quick minute and grab some rhubarb from our garden. So we just have a little bit of rhubarb left, but I wanna make sure it all gets used. With having these early mornings of needing to get out the door for swimming lessons, I wanna prep a big batch of baked oatmeal so that breakfast will be ready to go. I already made a bunch of hard-boiled eggs earlier, and we always have yogurt on hand to go along with the baked oatmeal, but since we have so many fresh mulberries and some rhubarb to use, we're gonna make a rhubarb mulberry baked oatmeal while our chili is canning. I'll post the full recipe for this one below as well, but when I was soaking our beans last night for the chili, I also soaked our oats, and this helps make the baked oatmeal more digestible, and it makes those nutrients more able to be absorbed by the body. I like to mix in several eggs and coconut oil to give it some good protein and healthy fats, as well as a little bit of sweetener and then the fruit to our soaked oats. So we're gonna mix this all up, put it in a pan, and it's gonna be ready to bake in the morning. Our chili is almost done in the pressure canner, and it's starting to get close to dinner time. So I'm going to start getting our toppings ready for our chili. We like to add shredded cheddar, avocado, and sour cream to our chili. So we're gonna get that stuff ready to go so we can eat dinner. Once your timer goes off, you wanna take your pressure canner off the stove to let it depressurize. If you took that weight off right away, it would let out a ton of steam. So I just like to let it naturally release the pressure. So while we eat dinner here, I'm just gonna let the pressure canner kind of naturally release and cool off a bit before I go ahead and pull that weight off. Even after waiting half an hour or 45 minutes after we eat dinner and I pull off this weight, everything is still really hot, really steamy. So you definitely want to be careful when you are doing this to not burn yourself. The special canning tongs are great at removing those hot jars from the canner.
Ooh, steaming.
So I'm gonna use those to take the jars out, and as they're cooling, at some point you will hear a ping or a pop, and when you hear that, that's your indication that the jar has sealed. So whenever that happens, we always do a bit of celebrating in our house because it's just a good thing to hear after you can something. So on the top of the lid, there's a little bump right in the middle. It's almost like a little bubble. And when you hear that ping, that little bubble gets sucked down. And so the jar is sealed and is gonna be completely flat, and you'll no longer feel that bubble anymore. At this point, your jars are canned, they're ready to go. One thing I will say is that I am terrible at labeling my canning jars, so I always just think, I'll remember what that is, I'll know when it was made, I'll keep that stuff straight, and then I never do, and I'm always like, what was this again? When did I make this? So it's really important to take the 5 minutes, label your jars so you know what it is and you're not having mystery jars that you have to figure out what they are later. So just something that I always need to remind myself of. Canning was definitely one of those things that felt really intimidating and really overwhelming at first. Like I had to stop everything else I was doing to focus my complete mental energy onto that specific task. But once you do it a few times, it really just does become second nature. And it's been so helpful for us to start incorporating in some of these afternoon batch cooking sessions to get a meal or 2 or 3 prepped for some day in the future. Because while it might not seem like a big deal, every time I've been in that situation of being in a pinch and just needing a meal in a hurry, I've always been so thankful to have those ready to go soups and stews and meals that I can just warm up and not need to do anything else for.